In 1851, the state of Massachusetts signed a contract to build a tunnel through the Berkshire Mountains. The estimate was $2 million. The timeline was 5 years. The tunnel would run 4 3/4 miles through solid granite, connecting the commercial centres of eastern Massachusetts to the markets of the American interior, and it would do it faster and cheaper than any mountain crossing in the country. It took 24 years. It cost $21 million. The first construction company went bankrupt after 9 years of work with less than 1 mile completed. The second company abandoned the contract and left. The state of Massachusetts eventually took over the project itself because by that point no private firm would touch it. 195 men died building it. The tunnel opened on February 9th, 1875. The Hoosac Tunnel, as it came to be called, was at the time of its completion the longest railroad tunnel in the Western Hemisphere and the second longest in the world. It had required the invention of 2 technologies that did not exist when the project began: compressed air rock drills and the systematic use of nitroglycerin as a blasting agent in American construction. Both of those inventions were forced into existence by the granite of the Berkshire Mountains, which defeated every tool and every method the engineers brought against it until the engineers ran out of options and had to invent new ones. This is the story of how Americans drilled the most expensive mile in American history, and what it cost the men who were inside the mountain when the costs were being paid. The Berkshire Mountains run north to south through western Massachusetts, a ridge of ancient metamorphic rock that had been a barrier to east-west travel since the first European settlers arrived in the region in the 17th century. The Connecticut River Valley to the east and the Hudson River Valley to the west were both productive agricultural and commercial regions, but the mountains between them meant that moving goods from one to the other required either a long detour north or south, or a slow and expensive passage over roads that were steep, narrow, and impassable in winter. The railroad changed the calculus. A railroad through the mountains, if it could be built, would connect Boston to the markets of Albany, Buffalo, and eventually Chicago, giving Massachusetts merchants a direct route to the American interior that their rivals in New York, who controlled the Erie Canal, had been exploiting for decades. The commercial argument was overwhelming. The engineering argument was the problem. The Berkshires at their highest point in this section run to roughly 2,000 feet above sea level. A railroad could not climb 2,000 feet and descend it on grades that locomotives of the period could handle. The only solution was to go through the mountain rather than over it, and going through it meant drilling a tunnel. The man who proposed the Hoosac Tunnel was a Massachusetts engineer named Alva Crocker. He had been studying the route for years before he brought the proposal to the state legislature in the late 1840s, and his cost estimate of $2 million was based on calculations that assumed the granite of the Berkshires would behave the way granite in European tunnel projects had behaved. Specifically, it assumed the rock would fracture cleanly under black powder blasting, allowing the tunnel crews to advance at a pace of roughly 2 feet per day. The assumption was wrong. The granite of the Hoosac Mountain, as the particular ridge the tunnel had to pass through was among the hardest rock formation in New England. It was not a uniform mass, but a mixture of granite and mica schist, with intrusions of quartz that were harder still, and with seams of water-bearing rock that flooded the workings when the drill holes broke through them. When the first crews began work at the western portal in the fall of 1851, they found rock that shattered their drill bits rather than fracturing cleanly, that swallowed black powder blasts without opening significant new face, and that wept water from every new surface the crews exposed. The men who did the drilling were working with hand tools that had not changed significantly since Roman engineers drove the first road tunnels through the Alps 18 centuries earlier. A drill was a steel rod, hardened at the tip, held against the rock face by one man, while another swung a sledgehammer against its head. After each hammer blow, the man holding the drill rotated it slightly, so the next blow struck a fresh point on the circular hole being cut. A 2-man team working this way could advance a drill hole roughly 2 inches per hour in the Hoosac granite. To blast a new section of rock face, the crew drilled a pattern of holes, packed them with black powder, inserted fuses and retired to a safe distance. When the powder went off, it should have broken the rock into manageable pieces that could be loaded into carts and removed. In most rock it did. In Hoosac granite, the results were less predictable. The rock absorbed the blast energy rather than fracturing along clean lines, leaving a face that was cratered and damaged but still largely intact, requiring the crews to re-drill and blast again, and again, before each advance of a foot or two. The pace in those first years was measured in feet per month rather than feet per day. The contractor who had taken on the project, a Massachusetts civil engineer named Herman Haupt, had built his estimate on the assumption that progress would average roughly 25 feet per week at each heading, the two working faces at the east and west portals of the tunnel. The actual pace in the first years ran between 5 and 10 feet per week at each heading, less than half what the estimate had required. The financial mathematics of the project collapsed within the first 3 years. Haupt had priced his contract at a figure that assumed a specific rate of progress. When the rock slowed that progress by more than half, his costs per foot of tunnel nearly doubled, but his payment rate, fixed in the contract, did not change. He spent the years between 1851 and 1861 attempting to renegotiate the contract with the state, advancing work in the most accessible sections to demonstrate progress, and borrowing money against future payment to cover the gap between his costs and his revenue. In 1861, after 9 years of work and the expenditure of several $1 million, Haupt's company had completed less than 1 mile of the 4 3/4 mile tunnel. The state of Massachusetts cancelled his contract and took back the project. Herman Haupt went on to serve as a brigadier general in the Union Army during the Civil War, commanding the railroad operations that supplied the Army of the Potomac. He was considered one of the most effective logistical officers of the war. He had not been an incompetent engineer. He had been an engineer who encountered rock that his methods could not advance through, at the pace the contract required, and the gap between the rock and the method had bankrupted him. The state of Massachusetts, now in possession of a tunnel that was less than a quarter complete after a decade of work, hired a new contractor in 1862. The firm of Doane, Nash & Carey took on the eastern section of the tunnel, while the state managed the western section directly. The new contractors brought more men, more capital, and a willingness to try methods that Haupt had not used. None of it moved the rock significantly faster. The fundamental problem remained. Black powder was not strong enough to fracture Hoosac granite efficiently. The rock absorbed the energy and held. The solution came from an unexpected direction. In 1847, an Italian chemist named Ascanio Sobrero had synthesized nitroglycerin, a liquid explosive so sensitive to shock that it had killed several of the researchers who worked with it in its first decade of existence. Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist who would later establish the prize that bears his name, had been working since the late 1850s to find a way to make nitroglycerin stable enough to transport and use in controlled conditions. In 1867, he patented dynamite. Nitroglycerin absorbed into diatomaceous earth to create a stable solid that could be handled without detonating spontaneously. But at the Hoosac Tunnel, nitroglycerin in its liquid form was used as a blasting agent beginning in 1866, a year before Nobel's dynamite patent, making the Hoosac project one of the first construction sites in America where nitroglycerin was systematically employed. The man responsible for introducing it was a chemist named George Mowbray, hired by the tunnel contractors to develop a local supply of the explosive rather than shipping it from distant manufacturers. Mowbray established a nitroglycerin production facility near the tunnel site, producing the liquid explosive on site and delivering it to the tunnel crews in small quantities for immediate use. The improvement in blasting performance was immediate and dramatic. A charge of nitroglycerin in a drill hole produced an explosive effect many times greater than the equivalent weight of black powder, and it transferred its energy to the surrounding rock more efficiently, producing cleaner fractures rather than the cratered, partially fractured faces that black powder left behind. Advance rates at the Hoosac headings increased from the 5 to 10 feet per week that had defeated Haupt's company to between 15 and 20 feet per week under nitroglycerin blasting. The cost of that improvement was paid in the lives of the men who handled the explosive. Nitroglycerin in its liquid form is not stable in the way that dynamite is stable. It is sensitive to heat, to shock, and to contamination with certain other materials. A container of liquid nitroglycerin dropped on a hard surface could detonate. A charge of nitroglycerin left in a drill hole and subjected to the vibration of nearby blasting could go off without the intentional application of a fuse. A batch produced with slightly impure ingredients could become unstable during storage. The men who drilled the holes and loaded the charges were working in a tunnel with no escape route faster than their own legs on a surface made of broken rock, with an explosive that gave no warning before it detonated. The tunnel walls, in the event of a premature detonation, reflected the blast back into the confined space of the working heading, where the overpressure was lethal to any man within range. The Berkshire County coroner's records from the years of nitroglycerin use at the Hoosac, 1866 through 1875, contain entries that read with a specific compression that coroner's records develop when the same cause of death appears repeatedly. Premature blast, premature detonation, explosion of unknown cause, the entries accumulate, the names change, the cause does not. One name that appears in those records is worth holding separately from the others, not because it is the worst entry in the file, but because what follows it is unlike anything else in the record. Ringo Kelly was a powderman working at the Hoosac Western Heading in the spring of 1865. A powderman's job was to load the blasting charges into the drill holes, insert the fuses, and detonate them. It required familiarity with the explosives being used, and judgment about the condition of each charge before it was lit. A powderman who did his job correctly advanced the tunnel face. A powderman who made an error, or who encountered a charge that had become unstable without visible sign, did not get a second opportunity. On March 20th, 1865, a charge of nitroglycerin at the Western Heading detonated prematurely. Ringo Kelly was killed instantly. Two other men working alongside him, named Billy Nash and Ned Brinkman, survived the blast with injuries. 1 year and 2 days later, on March 22, 1866, the bodies of Billy Nash and Ned Brinkman were found inside the tunnel, near the location where Kelly had been killed. The Berkshire County coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined. The North Adams Transcript, the local newspaper that covered the tunnel project closely throughout its construction, reported that there was no evidence of a blasting accident, and that the circumstances of the two men's deaths were not explained by any mechanical cause the investigators could identify. The tunnel workers had their own explanation. It was not one that appeared in the coroner's record. The Hoosac Tunnel had been producing unusual reports since the early years of the project. Men working in the deeper sections of the tunnel described sounds that they could not attribute to the work being done nearby. The presence of the dead was a common theme in the accounts that circulated among the crews. Mining and tunneling communities have always had traditions around the dangers of underground work that express themselves in terms of the uncanny rather than the mechanical, and the Hoosac project, with its death toll accumulating year by year, had developed those traditions in full. The deaths of Nash and Brinkman inside the tunnel, in the location where Kelly had died, with no mechanical explanation available to the investigators, gave the tradition a specific and documented anchor. The story of Ringo Kelly and the two men who had survived him and then died in the same place circulated in the region for decades after the tunnel was complete. What the coroner's record actually shows is that two men died in a tunnel under circumstances that the investigators of 1866 could not determine. That is the documented fact. What happened to Billy Nash and Ned Brinkman in the Hoosac Tunnel on or around March 22, 1866, is not known. The tunnel work continued. The second major technological development that the Hoosac project forced into existence was the compressed air rock drill. Hand drilling, the technique of one man holding a steel rod while another swung a hammer, was the universal method for making blast holes in rock at the start of the project. It was slow, physically exhausting, and limited in the depth of hole it could produce because the men doing the drilling needed to be close to the rock face, and the longer the drill rod, the harder it was to control. In 1866, an engineer named Charles Burley, working with the Hoosac contractors, developed a mechanical drill powered by compressed air. The Burley drill used compressed air delivered through a hose from a steam-powered compressor at the surface to drive a piston that struck the drill bit repeatedly, rotating it between strokes to advance the hole. A single Burley drill could advance a hole at several times the speed of a two-man hand drilling team, and it could be operated by one man rather than two, freeing the second man for other work. The Burley drill was not the first attempt at a mechanical rock drill. European engineers had experimented with steam-powered drills on the Mont Cenis tunnel in the Alps in the late 1850s, but the Burley drill was the first to achieve reliable performance in American conditions, and its development at the Hoosac project made it the prototype for the compressed air drilling technology that would be used in virtually every major tunnel and mine project in America for the next 50 years. The patent for the Burley drill was filed with the United States Patent Office in 1865. The patent number was 49,156. The machine it described would eventually be used in the construction of the New York City subway system, in the Cascade Tunnel in Washington State, and in the base tunnels of the Colorado Rockies. Every one of those projects built on the solution that the Hoosac granite had forced into existence. The central shaft was the other engineering problem that the Hoosac project had to solve, and that defined the project's pace for its middle years. The tunnel was too long to be driven from its two ends alone. The time required to meet in the middle, even at improved rates of progress, was too great for the project schedule to sustain. The solution was to sink a shaft from the surface down to the tunnel's center line, creating two additional working headings that could be driven in both directions from the shaft bottom, effectively turning the 4 3/4 mile tunnel into 4 shorter drives rather than 2. The central shaft was 1,028 feet deep. It was sunk through the same Hoosac granite that the tunnel headings were advancing through, and it was started before the Burley drill or nitroglycerin were available, which meant it was drilled by hand using the hammer and steel method, foot by foot through granite that the men at the top of the shaft could not see and could not predict. The workers who sank the central shaft operated from a platform suspended on ropes over the open hole. As the shaft deepened, the platform was lowered and the ropes extended. The broken rock from each blast had to be hauled to the surface in buckets, hand over hand up the shaft, a process that consumed as much labour as the drilling itself. Water infiltration at depth required continuous pumping, using horse-powered pumps at the surface that ran day and night during the critical years of shaft sinking. A man at the bottom of the central shaft in the mid-1860s was 1,000 feet below the surface of the Berkshire Mountains, in a hole barely wide enough to swing a hammer, with no light except what his candles provided, breathing air that the ventilation systems of the period could barely refresh at that depth, and working with explosives that killed men on the surface, with regular access to fresh air and room to run. The shaft took 4 years to complete. It was finished in 1870, by which point the Burley drills had arrived and the nitroglycerin supply from Mowbray's facility was reliable. The 4 headings that the shaft created, combined with the 2 portal headings, allowed the tunnel to advance simultaneously from 6 points. Progress by 1870 was finally approaching something close to the original estimate. It was 19 years too late. The man who ran the project in its final years was a Massachusetts civil engineer named Francis Shanley, who took over as chief engineer in 1868 after a succession of contractors had failed to deliver acceptable progress. Shanley brought discipline to the operation that it had not had before, standardizing the drill patterns at each heading, managing the nitroglycerin supply with more consistency than his predecessors, and keeping detailed records of advance rates and costs that were submitted to the state legislature in quarterly reports. His records are in the Massachusetts State Archives. They show the slow accumulation of footage, heading by heading, through the early 1870s, east heading, west heading, north from shaft, south from shaft, east portal, west portal, each entry a number, each number a measure of what the men inside the mountain had moved in the previous week. The tunnel broke through on Thanksgiving Day, November the 27th, 1873. The east and west headings, advancing toward each other through the centre of the mountain, met at a point that was within 3/4 of an inch of the alignment the original surveyors had established 22 years earlier. In 4 3/4 miles of granite drilled and blasted and hauled out by hand and by compressed air drill and by nitroglycerin, the 2 headings met within 3/4 of an inch. The precision of that result is not something that is easy to explain to a modern audience accustomed to GPS positioning and laser alignment tools. The surveyors who established the tunnel's centerline in 1851 worked with optical instruments, plumb bobs, and a chain of triangulation measurements from the surface that had to be projected underground by a process that accumulated error with every transfer. The tunnel crews working from both ends and from the central shaft had to maintain alignment in rock that was not uniform, in conditions where the survey marks at each heading were the only reference the crews had, and where a drift of a few degrees over a long distance would have produced a misalignment of many feet at the meeting point. 3/4 of an inch, in 4 3/4 miles. The men who achieved that result were not working with tools better than those available to Roman engineers. They were working with the same basic instruments that had been used in tunnel construction for centuries. What they had that Roman engineers did not was a body of accumulated surveying practice that had been refined by American engineers on canal and railroad projects for 30 years before the Hoosac project began, and a specific commitment to checking and rechecking the alignment at every possible opportunity as the headings advanced. The tunnel opened to rail traffic on February 9, 1875. The first train through was a Boston and Maine passenger service, and the occasion was marked by speeches from Massachusetts officials who were careful to emphasize the tunnel's commercial significance without dwelling too long on the 24 years, the $21 million, and the 195 dead that the commercial significance had required. The Boston Daily Globe covered the opening in terms that were enthusiastically positive and almost entirely forward-looking. The tunnel was a triumph of Massachusetts engineering. It would transform the commercial relationship between Boston and the interior. It represented the state's commitment to modern infrastructure. It did not mention Ringo Kelly. It did not mention Billy Nash or Ned Brinkman. It did not mention the 4 years of hand drilling that sank the central shaft, or the men at the bottom of that shaft breathing air that the pumps could barely replace, or the nitroglycerin batches that went off without warning in the confined space of the working headings. The Hoosac Tunnel Commission's final report to the Massachusetts legislature, submitted in 1876, is a different kind of document. It is a cost accounting, exhaustive and precise, that traces every dollar of the $21 million through the project's life. It identifies the sections where progress was slowest and the reasons for the slowness. It documents the contractor failures and the state interventions. It records the technological developments, the Burley drill and the nitroglycerin program, in the language of engineering rather than celebration. The Commission's mortality report is a separate section, 195 deaths confirmed. The report acknowledges that the actual number was likely higher, because the records from the early years of the project, when private contractors were running the work without state oversight, were incomplete. Small operations did not always report. Men who died of injuries sustained in the tunnel sometimes died days or weeks later in boarding houses in North Adams or in hospitals in Pittsfield, and the connection to the tunnel work was not always recorded in the death register. 195 confirmed, the actual number almost certainly higher. The tunnel served the Boston and Maine Railroad and its successors for the better part of a century after its opening. It is still in operation today, carrying freight trains through the Berkshire Mountains under Hoosac Mountain, on a route that was surveyed in 1849 by engineers who thought it would take 5 years and $2 million. The bore they drilled is the same bore that trains pass through now. The granite that resisted every tool the engineers brought against it in the 1850s is still there, on both sides of the track, exactly as hard as it was when the first crews began drilling in 1851. The water that flooded the workings still seeps through the joints in the rock and runs down the tunnel walls and collects in the drainage channels that the construction crews built into the floor. The tunnel is dark inside except when a train passes. The passage takes approximately 8 minutes at freight train speed. The air inside is cold and damp and carries the smell of stone and the faint residue of diesel exhaust from the locomotives. 8 minutes, 4 3/4 miles, 24 years. The men who built it are in the records if the records survived, and mostly not in any other place. The Berkshire County Coroner's dockets are in Pittsfield, in the county courthouse, in files that researchers can access by appointment. The Massachusetts State Archives in Boston hold the commission reports, the engineering records, and the contractor correspondence. The patent records for the Burley drill are in the National Archives. The North Adams transcript's coverage of the project is available on microfilm at the North Adams Public Library. What those records hold, taken together, is a picture of a project that cost 10 times its estimate, took 5 times as long as projected, killed nearly 200 men, and produced in the process 2 technologies that transformed American construction for the next half-century. The compressed air rock drill that Charles Burley developed for the Hoosac granite was the direct predecessor of the pneumatic drills used in the construction of the New York City subway beginning in 1900. The nitroglycerin program that George Mowbray ran at his North Adams facility was the first systematic industrial use of high explosives in American construction, establishing the safety protocols and handling procedures that the construction industry built on for decades. Both technologies exist because the Hoosac granite defeated the tools that were available in 1851. Both were forced into existence by a material problem that the engineers of the period could not solve with existing methods. The The mountain made the inventions necessary, and the inventions paid for themselves many times over in the projects that came after. The 195 men who died in the Hoosac tunnel did not benefit from the technologies their deaths helped produce. They were there before the Burley drill made the work faster, and before the nitroglycerin program was organised to reduce the incidence of premature blasts. They were there in the years when progress was measured in feet per month, and the tools were steel rods and sledgehammers and black powder that the granite mostly ignored. A man named Thomas Sullivan appears in the North Adams transcript in the spring of 1859, in a brief item reporting that he had been injured in a blasting accident at the eastern heading of the Hoosac tunnel. The injury was described as serious. The item notes that he had been working at the tunnel for 3 years and was known to the crews there as a reliable hand. He does not appear in the paper again. Whether he recovered, whether he returned to the work, whether he was among the confirmed dead or among the uncounted, the record does not say. He was there for 3 years, drilling holes in Hoosac granite with a steel rod and a hammer, 6 feet from a rock face that gave back less than 10 feet a week, in exchange for the work of 12 men doing the hardest labour the period offered. He was injured in the spring of 1859. The tunnel would not open for another 16 years. Thomas Sullivan didn't see it open. The record is silent on whether he survived to see anything at all. The tunnel is still there. The granite is still there. 8 minutes at freight speed, 4 3/4 miles, in the dark under Hoosac Mountain, the water running down the walls the same as it ran the day the first crew started drilling in the fall of 1851. $2 million. 5 years. That was the estimate. $21 million. 24 years. 195 dead. That was what the mountain cost. The commercial argument for the Hoosac Tunnel had been made repeatedly and at length by its proponents in the Massachusetts legislature through the 1840s and 1850s, and it was essentially correct. Boston was losing freight traffic to New York. The Erie Canal, which had opened in 1825 and connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, had given New York merchants a direct water route to the interior of the continent that Massachusetts could not match. The goods coming out of Ohio and Michigan and the growing farms of the Midwest moved east on the canal to New York, not to Boston, because the route was cheaper and faster. A railroad tunnel through the Berkshires would change that. It would give Boston a direct rail connection to Albany, and through Albany to the network of western railroads that were pushing further into the interior every year. The freight that was going to New York would have a reason to go to Boston instead, if the Boston route was competitive in time and cost. This argument was sound and remained sound throughout the 24 years of construction, which is one reason the project was not abandoned when the first contractor went bankrupt in 1861 and when the costs began accumulating at a rate that would have caused most public works projects of the period to be cancelled. The commercial case never weakened. The Berkshire granite was the problem, not the destination. The legislators who voted year after year to continue funding the project, even as the costs climbed past $5 million, past $10 million, past $15 million, were not making irrational decisions. They were making decisions based on a correct assessment of the commercial value of the completed tunnel, combined with a persistent optimism about how much longer it would take to finish, that proved wrong repeatedly, but not in a way that invalidated the underlying commercial logic. The project produced a specific kind of institutional learning that is visible in the commission reports. Each year's report was more precise than the last about the actual conditions in the tunnel, the actual rates of advance, the actual costs per foot of granite removed. The early reports are optimistic in ways that later reports are not, because the early reports were written by men who still believed the original estimate was achievable with better management and more resources. The later reports are written by men who had learned from the granite that the original estimate was not achievable, and who had adjusted their projections accordingly. Francis Shanley's quarterly reports from 1868 to 1875 read like the work of a man who has made his peace with the material. He does not project faster progress. He reports the actual progress and adjusts the completion estimate upward when the evidence requires it. His tone is not pessimistic, but it is not optimistic either. It is the tone of an engineer who has learned to let the rock tell him what is possible and report what the rock says rather than what the contract specifies. The state legislature received those reports and continued funding the project because the commercial alternative, abandoning a tunnel that was already 3/4 complete and writing off the money already spent, was worse than continuing. The economics of the decision changed as the tunnel progressed. In 1861, when the project was less than a quarter complete, and the cost overrun was already severe, The argument for abandonment was stronger than it would ever be again. After 1861, every year that passed and every foot of tunnel completed made the case for continuing more compelling, because the incremental cost of the remaining footage was declining relative to the value of the completed project. This is a pattern in large infrastructure projects that appears in the Hoosac records with unusual clarity because the project was so long and the documentation so detailed. The decision to continue is not always the rational decision in the early years. It becomes the rational decision in the later years, when the sunk cost is large enough that abandonment is economically worse than completion, even if completion is more expensive than originally projected. The Massachusetts legislature navigated this calculation correctly, even if the navigation was often political rather than analytical. The commercial interests that stood to benefit from the completed tunnel lobbied consistently for continuation. The regions of western Massachusetts that depended on the railroad connection lobbied for continuation. The construction workers and suppliers who had ongoing contracts lobbied for continuation. Against these interests, the argument for abandonment had few organized advocates, because the people who would benefit most from stopping the project were the taxpayers of Massachusetts generally, a diffuse group without a single institutional voice. The tunnel was completed because the interests favoring completion were organized, and the interests favoring abandonment were not. The engineering logic favored completion in the later years. The political logic had favored it from the beginning. The men who died in the tunnel were not a political factor in any of these calculations. Their deaths appeared in the commission reports as numbers in a mortality table. The reports did not advocate for improved safety conditions in the language of obligation. They recorded the deaths as costs in the same section of the document that recorded the cost of broken drill bits and the price of nitroglycerin per gallon. This was standard practice in the public works documentation of the period. A death on a construction project was a cost in the sense that it required the contractor to find and train a replacement worker, and in some cases to pay compensation to a widow or dependent, and it was documented in those terms. The moral dimension of the cost, if it was considered at all by the men writing the reports, did not appear in the reports themselves. The North Adams transcript was a different kind of document. The newspaper covered the tunnel project as a local story, which meant it covered the men who worked in it as local people, with names and families and circumstances that the commission reports did not record. When a man was killed in the tunnel, the transcript ran an item with his name, his age, his occupation, and where he'd been living. When a family was left without income, the transcript sometimes noted that as well. These items are brief. They are written in the compressed, factual style of 19th century local journalism, which did not have space or convention for the kind of extended account that a modern newspaper might give a workplace fatality. But they are there, in the microfilm at the North Adams Public Library, one item after another through the 24 years of construction, each one a name that the commission reports rendered as a number. The names are Irish predominantly. The labour force that built the Hoosac Tunnel was drawn largely from the Irish immigrant communities of New England, men who had come to America in the decade of the famine and its aftermath, and who had settled in the industrial towns of Massachusetts and Connecticut and found work in whatever heavy construction was being done. Tunnel work paid better than most alternatives. It was more dangerous than most alternatives. The men who took the work understood both of these facts. A tunneler's wage in the Hoosac project in the 1860s ran between $1.50 and $2 per day for common labour, with powder men and drill operators at the top of that range. $1.50 per day was a wage that could sustain a family in North Adams in 1865, if the work was steady and the winters were not too hard. The work was not always steady. The tunnel had periods of reduced activity when funding was constrained or when a contractor transition delayed operations, and in those periods the men who'd been working underground were working somewhere else, or not working at all. The boarding houses of North Adams and the surrounding towns held the tunnel workforce through the construction years. The town itself grew substantially during the tunnel project, from a small agricultural community in the early 1850s to a town of several thousand people by the 1870s, supported by the spending of the construction workforce and the businesses that served them. When the tunnel opened in 1875 and the construction crews dispersed, North Adams retained a population that was larger than it had been before the tunnel began, but that now lacked the payroll that had supported that population. Some of the men who had worked the tunnel stayed in the region and found work in the textile mills that were the town's other major industry. Others moved on to the next large construction project, which in the mid-1870s was the railroad network pushing into the Rocky Mountain West. The skills they carried, the ability to work in confined underground spaces with high explosives and compressed air drills, were in demand in the silver and gold mines of Colorado and Nevada, and in the railroad tunnels that the transcontinental network required through the mountain ranges of the West. The Hoosac Tunnel had trained a generation of tunnel workers, and those workers spread the methods and the tools that the Hoosac project had developed across the American West in the decades that followed. The Burley drill went with them. The nitroglycerin handling protocols that Mowbray had developed went with them. The knowledge of how to ventilate a long tunnel heading, how to manage the water infiltration that granite almost always produced, how to read a rock face for the signs of instability that meant the next blast was likely to produce a cave rather than a clean advance. All of that went with them, carried in the heads of men whose names are mostly in the North Adams transcript rather than in any engineering manual. The tunnel they built is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The portal structures at both ends have been preserved in their original form. A historical marker at the western portal in Florida, Massachusetts, the town through which the tunnel passes at that end, describes the engineering achievement and the construction timeline and the cost. It mentions that the tunnel is still in use. It does not mention the 195 men. The coroner's records are in Pittsfield. The commission reports are in Boston. The newspaper items are on microfilm in North Adams. The tunnel runs 4 3/4 miles through the granite of Hoosac Mountain, and trains pass through it in 8 minutes, and the water runs down the walls the same way it ran when Thomas Sullivan was drilling holes in the eastern heading in the winter of 1859, 3 feet from a rock face that gave back less than 10 feet a week. He was there, the record says so, once, in a brief item in the North Adams transcript in the spring of 1859. After that, the record is silent. The tunnel is not. The geology of the Hoosac Mountain is worth understanding on its own terms, separate from what it cost to drill through it. The Berkshire Mountains are old in the way that only a few mountain ranges on the North American continent are old. They are not the young, sharp peaks of the Rockies or the Cascades, which are geologically recent and still rising. The Berkshires are the remnants of a range that was once as tall as the modern Alps, worn down over 500 million years of erosion to the rounded, forested ridges that the tunnel surveyors mapped in 1849. What remains is the core of the original range, the hardest rock, the material that resisted erosion long enough to still be standing when everything softer around it had been carried to the sea. The granite at the Hoosac heading was hard because it had survived 500 million years of everything the earth could put it through. It had been buried under miles of younger rock, subjected to the heat and pressure that turned softer material into schist and slate, and had come through it still granite, still the same interlocking crystal structure of quartz and feldspar and mica that had formed when the original magma cooled beneath the surface of a continent that no longer exists in that form. The men who drilled it in the 1850s and 1860s did not know any of this. They knew that it was hard, that it resisted their drill bits and absorbed their black powder charges, and held the walls of the tunnel without requiring the timber shoring that softer rock demanded. The hardness that made it so difficult to advance through was also the hardness that made the completed tunnel walls stable. The Hoosac Tunnel, once completed, required less ongoing maintenance of its walls and ceiling than a tunnel of comparable length, through softer material would have required, because the granite that defeated the construction crews also held itself up without assistance once the tunnel was through it. This is one of the reasons the tunnel is still in use 150 years after it opened. The Berkshire granite that cost 195 men their lives and $21 million and 24 years to drill through has held the tunnel open without significant structural failure since 1875. The material that was the project's enemy during construction became its asset after completion, and the investment in forcing a hole through it has paid dividends in reduced maintenance costs across a century and a half of operation. The engineers who planned the project understood this in principle. A tunnel through hard rock was preferable in the long term to a tunnel through soft rock, because hard rock tunnels were more stable and required less ongoing support. The problem was the time horizon. In the long term, the Hoosac Tunnel's granite walls were an advantage. In the short term of the construction project, they were a catastrophe. The men who paid the cost of the short term were not the men who received the benefit of the long term. This is a pattern that appears in the Hoosac records more clearly than in most comparable projects, because the documentation is so complete and the timeline so extended. The construction workers who died in the tunnel between 1851 and 1875 paid a cost that the freight shippers of 1880 and 1890 and 1900 collected as a benefit. The $21 million paid by Massachusetts taxpayers in the construction period was returned to Massachusetts commerce in the decades of cheaper freight rates and improved access to Western markets that the tunnel made possible. Whether the exchange was fair is a question the Commission reports do not ask. They were not written to ask it. They were written to document the cost and the engineering achievement, and they do both with considerable precision. The question of fairness belongs to a different kind of document, and that document does not exist for the Hoosac Tunnel. The men who worked in it did not write memoirs. The contractors who managed them did not reflect in published form on what the project had required of the people who built it. The newspaper items in the North Adams transcript are the closest thing that exists to a record of the human experience of the construction, and they are brief, factual, and compressed in the way of local journalism that does not have space for extended reflection. What can be said is what the records show: 195 men confirmed dead. A project that ran 24 years past its projected completion date and 10 times its projected cost. 2 technologies invented or first systematically deployed in American construction at the Hoosac site, because the granite made existing technologies inadequate. A tunnel that opened in 1875 and is still carrying trains in the 21st century, through the same bore that the men with hand drills and nitroglycerin and compressed air equipment cut through Hoosac Mountain between 1851 and 1873. The central shaft is still there. It runs 1,028 feet from the surface of the mountain down to the tunnel center line. It is no longer used for ventilation or for lowering workers and materials, as it was during construction. It serves now as a ventilation shaft for the operating tunnel, drawing fresh air down from the surface and circulating it through the bore. The shaft was sunk by hand, foot by foot through granite, in the years before the Burley drill arrived. 4 years of work. A platform suspended over an open hole, 1,000 feet deep, with men at the bottom doing in confined space and limited air what the surface crews were doing with the benefit of daylight and room to move. No names from the central shaft sinking survive in the records that are easily accessible. The Commission reports record the footage advanced per month and the costs incurred. The individual men who did the advancing are in the payroll ledgers, if those ledgers survived, and in the Berkshire County coroner's records if they died there, and otherwise not in any document that a researcher sitting in the Massachusetts State Archives in 2025 can find. They were there, the shaft is there, one follows from the other. The Hoosac Tunnel's western portal sits in a small town called Florida, Massachusetts, on the eastern slope of the Berkshire Ridge above the town of North Adams. The portal is a stone arch, the original masonry from the 1860s, framed by trees that have grown up in the 150 years since the construction camp stood on this ground. The tracks run through the arch into the dark. 8 minutes later, in the town of Charlemont on the eastern side, they emerge from another stone arch into the light of the Deerfield River Valley. You can stand at the western portal and hear a train coming for several minutes before it appears, the sound building in the tunnel and emerging from the portal before the locomotive does. The sound is the same sound that the first Boston and Maine passenger train made when it came through on February 9, 1875, and the politicians on the observation car heard the sound of the tunnel opening up in front of them and knew that the 24 years were over. What they heard, more precisely, was the sound of a hole through Hoosac Mountain that 195 men had died to make. The hole is still there. The sound still comes out of it. Thomas Sullivan drilled some of it with a steel rod and a hammer in the winter of 1859, 3 feet from the eastern face, 10 feet a week through the hardest rock in New England. The North Adams transcript mentioned him once. After that, nothing. The tunnel remembers differently. It remembers in granite, in the walls that the men cut and blasted and hauled out one broken piece at a time over 24 years, walls that have held without significant failure for 150 years, and that will hold for 150 more. That is what the mountain cost. That is what it kept. The technology transfer that came out of the Hoosac project is worth tracing in more detail, because it connects the tunnel directly to the construction of the modern American landscape in ways that the tunnel's own history does not make obvious. The Burley drill, patented in 1865 and first deployed at the Hoosac in 1866, was not simply a faster version of hand drilling. It changed the fundamental economics of underground construction by separating the energy source from the men doing the drilling. In hand drilling, the energy came from the men swinging the hammer, and the rate of advance was limited by how long men could sustain that effort. A two-man hand drilling team reached its physical limit within hours and needed rest before it could resume. The Burley drill, driven by compressed air from a surface compressor, could run continuously as long as the compressor ran and the drill bits held their edge. This changed the calculation for what was worth building. Projects that had been too slow to be economically viable with hand drilling became viable with compressed air equipment, because the advance rate was fast enough to justify the capital cost of the compressor and the drilling equipment. The expansion of American hard rock mining in the 1870s and 1880s, in the silver fields of Nevada and the gold camps of Colorado and the copper mines of Montana, was built on compressed air drilling technology that traced directly to the Hoosac project. The men who carried the technology west were in many cases the same men who had learned it at the Hoosac headings. A tunneler who had worked at North Adams in 1868 and 1869, operating Burley drills and loading nitroglycerin charges, had skills that were in demand at the Comstock mines in Nevada, and at the railroad tunnels being cut through the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies. The labour market for underground construction workers in the 1870s was national in a way it had not been before the Hoosac project, because the project had trained enough men in the new techniques to supply the demand that the Western expansion created. George Mowbray's nitroglycerin operation near North Adams was the other technology that spread. Mowbray himself published a technical account of his work at the Hoosac project in 1872, a pamphlet titled Trinitroglycerin, as applied in the Hoosac tunnel and to submarine blasting. The pamphlet described his production methods, his handling protocols and his safety procedures in enough detail that engineers at other projects could adapt them. It was one of the first systematic accounts of industrial explosive handling published in the United States, and it circulated among mining and railroad engineers in the years when the Western construction boom was creating demand for exactly that knowledge. Alfred Nobel's dynamite, which became commercially available in the American market in the early 1870s, replaced liquid nitroglycerin as the standard blasting agent for most applications because it was more stable and easier to transport. But the handling knowledge that Mowbray's operation had developed, the understanding of how to store high explosives safely, how to manage the interaction between the explosive and the rock, how to design a blast pattern that produced the fracture the engineer intended, rather than a random redistribution of energy through the face. That knowledge was applicable to dynamite as readily as to nitroglycerin, and it moved with the men who had learned it. The New York City subway system, which began construction in 1900, used compressed air drilling and dynamite blasting through the granite and schist of Manhattan Island. The engineers who supervised that work were working with technology that had been developed or refined at the Hoosac Tunnel 30 years earlier. The Manhattan schist that the subway tunnels were cut through is geologically similar to the Hoosac granite, hard, resistant and water-bearing in the same ways, and the methods that worked at Hoosac were the methods that worked on the island of Manhattan. The men who drilled the subway tunnels were in some cases the sons of men who had drilled the Hoosac headings. The Irish tunnelling families of New England sent their sons into the same trade that had employed their fathers, following the work from project to project across the decades. A family name in the Hoosac Commission payroll records of 1868 might appear in the New York subway construction records of 1901, a generation later, doing the same work with improved tools in a different hole, in a different kind of rock in a different state. The continuity of the trade across the generations is visible in the records where they overlap, and it is one of the things that makes the Hoosac project significant beyond its own construction history. It was not just a tunnel, it was a school for underground construction, a place where the methods of the next 50 years of American tunnel and mine construction were developed and tested by the men who had no other choice but to make them work. The school had a terrible tuition, 195 confirmed dead. The actual number higher, 24 years, $21 million. What it produced was a generation of men who knew how to go into a mountain and come back out with a railroad running through it. That knowledge built the American West as surely as the railroads themselves did, because without the tunnels, the railroads could not have crossed the mountains, and without the mountains crossed, the West could not have been reached at the speed and scale that the expansion required. The Hoosac Tunnel is the beginning of that chain. It is where the methods were developed that the mountain crossings of the 1870s and 1880s depended on. It is where Charles Burley built the drill that every hard rock miner in Nevada and Colorado and Montana used for the next 30 years. It is where George Mowbray worked out how to produce and handle a liquid explosive that killed men without warning, and how to do it in a way that killed fewer men than it would have otherwise. It is also where Thomas Sullivan drilled holes in granite in the winter of 1859, 10 feet a week, for $1.50 a day, until the North Adams transcript mentioned him once and then never again. He was part of what built the American interior. That much is certain. Whether he lived to know it is not.